In this feature, you are going to learn about how Thomas Galvin, forced to be an executioner, and the women he executed became next on his hit list.
He was the first hangman in Kilmainham Jail. He was a hangman for Dublin City and County at first, then became Dublin County, and then a little bit later went back and took on Dublin as well.
Usually executioners got their careers through family businesses. Thomas got his a different way.
He started out as a postilion, basically a driver. He used to ride the horse leading the carriage for the Duke of Leinster. It was a nice job, not too well paid but comfortable. But then he was caught for a highway robbery and sentenced to death. So he was given a choice: die or kill, basically. And so he became hangman. And that was fairly common. An awful lot of hangmen, in Ireland in particular, became hangmen because they had been sentenced to death and there were no hangmen, and the only way out was to become the hangman. It was a position, as you can imagine, that was frowned upon by the general people. So you'd only do it in a lot of cases as a last resort.
With having no choice with his career, he lived and worked in Kilmainham. The prisoners in Kilmainham were not happy with this.
He was based in Kilmainham. He lived in Kilmainham. He lived in the jail on what was the women's side of the jail. He lived there. And indeed, much later the women complained about the hangman. It wasn't him living on their side of the jail, and he had to move back to the centre of the jail where there were other places that he could live in. But he lived in the jail.
Each executioner done different executions, public, private and high profile people. But Thomas done them all, and more.
Initially all executions were public because they were seen as a warning to the public. So they had to be out there, you had to see what happened. But of course, as we know, they became public spectacles and great fun and etc. So gradually they were moved inside. But he carried out all of his executions in public. But he didn't just do executions. He did all the punishment. So floggings, whipping down the street with people, etc. These were all part of his thing. And in Kilmainham, he was also one of the people who served the food to the prisoners. After 1798, the leaders of the 1798 rebellion, for example, complained that their food was being served to them by the hangman. They just didn't want him touching it. Well, certainly in the early 19th century, the worst crime you could commit was to steal from the rich. Property was the ultimate thing. Life didn't matter so much. It did matter, but not so much. Murder was obviously a serious crime, but often enough you'd get sentenced to 4 years for murder or 10 years, not necessarily executed. That usually only happened if it was a particularly heinous crime, if it was an out of the ordinary type of murder. The worst thing you could do was highway robbery, housebreaking, forgery was another one. Again, because you're stealing money, sort of really serious. If you were caught with, say, the plates for forging notes, that you were guaranteed to be sentenced to death and probably executed. The only way out of that was to turn informer on your colleagues.
In his 44-year career that he was forced into, he executed a lot of prisoners.
Galvin in all did about 130 or so executions in Kilmainham Jail alone. Now, when you consider that's out of about 180 that were carried out in total in the jail, right up to 1924, that's a huge proportion because he was there for the first 30 or so years of the jail's existence. But he also did executions in Dublin City, in Newgate, for example. I have a couple of references to him by name, but generally the hangman there is not named, so it's difficult to know what he did. I've seen articles that claim he carried out about 150 executions, but I would honestly say that's a low estimate. Probably closer to 200 in total, because certainly in Newgate there would have been a lot of executions going on, more than there were in Kilmainham. So I'd be surprised if he didn't nearly double that the number he had in Kilmainham. So I would say 200 plus.
As Thomas was not well known, I think this execution put him on the map. The execution that most people claim to have done is the execution of Robert Emmet. There are many rumours of what happened at the execution of Emmet, but Michael knows the real story.
The most famous execution that he carried out, it's disputed that he actually did it, because other people have claimed they did it. They're wrong, they couldn't possibly have done it. It has to have been him, and that was the execution of Robert Emmet in front of St. Catherine's Church there on Thomas Street. Emmet was sentenced to be hanged, drawn and quartered, and it was the last such execution to be carried out in Ireland. Now, he didn't hang, draw and quarter him because he didn't know how to do it. Galvin was a butcher, he didn't know his job at all. But when he went down to execute Emmet, the normal way you hang, draw and quarter somebody is you hang them for a period of time until they're unconscious, not dead. Then you draw and quarter them, cut off their head, cut their body into 4 parts, etc. You do it while they're unconscious. Galvin rushed the execution. Emmet was trying to delay. I think there was some suggestion there might be a rescue attempt. And Galvin eventually just turned him off. Literally, he was standing on a plank, turned it over, dropped him off, left him hanging. There's various stories on this, whether Emmet was alive or not after the hanging, but I think he was dead, but just dead. Then he had to quarter him and behead him, but he had forgotten to bring the equipment. He had nothing with him, so he had to send across to a butcher shop across the road for a butcher's block and for a hacksaw. So, and because he didn't have knives, he couldn't actually open up the body, so we just cut the head off with a hacksaw. Now, because the body was just freshly dead, the blood was continuing to flow, and people saw this and said Emmet was alive when this happened. But he would have been dead, even if alive, he would have been dead very quickly, because it cut through the carotid artery and, you'd be dead pretty well immediately. But no, he was almost certainly dead. So Emmet was not hanged, drawn and quartered, but hanged and beheaded, despite the court sentence. But that was probably the most famous one he did. I mean, he executed people like the Shears brothers after 1798 and a few others from then. They would have been down in Newgate. But he executed everybody who was sentenced to death in Kilmainham jail up to his own death in 1830.
Throughout his career, he only executed 3 women. As women were treated differently to men, it was hard to execute them. It would only take a large crime for them to be executed.
3 in total. The only 3 who were executed ever in Kilmainham jail. Women were a problem. They would be sentenced to death as normal. There was no problem with that at all. The courts were sentenced to death, but almost invariably that sentence was commuted to imprisonment of some sort. They were seen as the fairer, gentler sex. They were supposed to be protected. It was difficult for anyone to execute them. He executed 3. And it was only 2 executions. It was 1, Rose Kelly, and then the 2 Bridgets as a double execution.
The first woman he executed was Rose Kelly. She was a dangerous and evil woman who murdered a 5-year-old girl. Rose was not well educated, poor, and would do anything to make fast money to feed her single life.
Rose Kelly, I would say, was probably the only person hanged in Kilmainham jail who deserved to be hanged. 1802, she was walking around Dublin, met a little 5-year-old girl and took her with her, bought her some sweets, etc., spent the day with her, and the next day up at Inchicore Bridge on the Grand Canal, the little girl was found face down in a pool of water, naked. Now, a lot of people think this was a sexual crime. It wasn't. It had nothing to do with that. She killed her to get her clothes. It was a common practice to steal good clothes from young kids and sell them. And that's all she did. The child was well dressed. So she stole her clothes and killed her for that. She was a horrid and an awful woman. She was 35 plus, foul-mouthed. She went to the gallows not screaming but cursing everybody. In court she cursed the judge and everybody else there, and it was just the way she was. I presume that she was probably a heavy drinker as well, but I don't know, that's a presumption. But she was a really horrendous woman, and I think we're better off without her.
The last two women he executed were known as the two Bridgets, Bridget Butterly and Bridget Ennis, with a great plan to steal from their old employer and run off to England for a new life.
Well, the two Bridgets, basically, Bridget Butterly was working for a man called Pike, if I remember his name, Captain Pike, and she was a servant. The usual thing happened. He seduced her, she got pregnant, he fired her. She couldn't get a job in Ireland because he wouldn't give her a reference. So with her other friend Bridget, also Bridget, they were going to England, but they needed money. They decided they'd rob his house. Waited till he was out and broke in, met his wife. In defending themselves, the wife was struck with a poker and died. So here you had the two ultimates. You had a murder and you had stealing property. So they were sentenced to death for that and didn't get off. They were sent to Kilmainham jail, where they screamed the house down. They were so distraught. They were only young, very early 20s. And indeed the Sisters of Charity were brought in by George Dunn, who was the head jailer, the governor of the jail at the time, brought them in to try and calm them down. And that began the Sisters of Charity's mission to caring for prisoners. They were so successful with them that they calmed them down, and they went to the gallows peacefully at the end, remorseful but peaceful.
The life of a hangman had their downfalls by taking the life of people. But as they were feared, Thomas made a lot of money after every execution.
People held the hangman in fear, obviously. This guy's going to kill you if you're not careful. They hated him for what he did because he killed people. Yet there was almost a sense that they were revered. These were notable people. The other thing is, part of this is that there were these pirogues or folk tales about dead bodies. If you had warts on your hand and you rubbed your hand against a dead body, it'd cure the warts. So people would pay Galvin to let them get up to the corpse and rub their hands against it, or rub their children's hand against the corpse to cure warts. He would go down after a hanging. He'd go down to what is now the Patriot Inn beside Kilmainham Jail. It was then the Queen's Rest or something. But he would sit there at the counter and he'd have the rope that he'd used and he'd sell bits of it. He would have the clothes from the dead man and he would sell those as well. So you could get, and these were souvenirs. It wasn't he was selling second-hand clothes. These were sold as souvenirs and they would have a premium price. He would sell part of the paraphernalia every time. In later years, he became more a raconteur than a hangman because they just ran out of executions, maybe one a year. He'd be down in the pub as an old man. He'd be telling stories and people would come and visit him and see him, and he would have his rope there and he would show them how he did it, and he'd put the rope around your neck and pull it tight and pretend he was going to choke you. All for the price of a drink.
Thomas Galvin, who was forced into being an executioner, stuck with the profession for 44 years up until his death at age 93. It's not a job that everyone dreams of, but some people had to do it back then, forced or a family business.